Dearest listeners, it has been said that the most carefully orchestrated matches often produce the most unexpected harmonies, or indeed, the most spectacular discord. Should this tale of unexpected love touch your hearts as deeply as it has touched mine, do share your appreciation in whatever manner you find most agreeable, and perhaps encourage others to join our intimate circle of devoted listeners who gather here for these chronicles of the heart. Today, your humble chronicler brings you the most extraordinary tale of a wedding that shocked all of London society, wherein a duke married quite the wrong sister, though perhaps, as Providence would have it, precisely the right bride. But let us not rush, for the best stories, like the finest aged port, require patience to reveal their true character. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Pembroke House as Lady Catherine Pembroke sat at her escritoire, her quill poised above a half-finished letter to her dearest friend in Bath. At 23, she possessed what the ton considered a pleasant countenance, soft brown eyes that held uncommon intelligence, chestnut hair that refused to hold the elaborate coiffures à la mode, and a figure that, whilst perfectly respectable, lacked the willowy elegance of her elder sister, Lady Margaret. Margaret, who at 25 should have been approaching the dreaded designation of spinster, remained the acknowledged beauty of the family. Her golden hair caught light like spun silk, her blue eyes sparkled with perpetual gaiety, and her laugh had been known to stop conversations in crowded ballrooms. It was Margaret who drew the attention of every eligible gentleman who crossed the threshold of their Mayfair residence, whilst Catherine observed from the periphery, content with her books, her correspondence, and her watercolors. Their father, the Earl of Pembroke, had long ago resigned himself to the peculiarities of his daughters. Margaret, despite her beauty, had rejected no fewer than 7 proposals over the past 4 seasons, each refusal accompanied by increasingly creative excuses. Catherine, meanwhile, had shown such complete indifference to the marriage mart that many amongst the ton had begun to whisper she might be destined for confirmed spinsterhood, a fate she contemplated with surprising equanimity. The household operated with the precision of a well-oiled timepiece. The Earl spent his mornings in his study, reviewing estate matters from their holdings in Somerset. The Countess devoted herself to managing the intricate social calendar that governed their lives from March through July. Margaret practiced at the pianoforte, her fingers dancing across the keys with the same effortless grace she displayed in everything. And Catherine observed, recorded, and understood far more than anyone credited her with possessing the wit to comprehend. It was on this particular morning in early May that a letter arrived bearing the seal of the Duchess of Blackthorn. The Countess's hands trembled slightly as she broke the wax, for correspondence from her Grace was as rare as it was significant. The Duchess, widowed these past 5 years, ruled her son's vast estates with an iron hand concealed beneath kid gloves. Her son, Robert Blackthorn, the 9th Duke of Blackthorn, was acknowledged as the greatest matrimonial prize in England. 29 years of age, possessed of £40,000 per annum, 3 estates, and a countenance that caused young ladies to require their smelling salts with alarming frequency. The contents of the letter sent the Countess into such a state of excitement that she quite forgot the proper dignity expected of a woman of her station. She burst into the morning room where her daughters sat at their various occupations, her face flushed with triumph. The Duchess had written to propose a match, not merely to suggest the possibility, but to declare her intention of seeing her son wed to Lady Margaret Pembroke before the season's end. She had observed Margaret at various gatherings and found her to possess precisely the qualities she deemed essential in a future Duchess of Blackthorn: beauty, accomplishment, and breeding of the highest order. The letter contained an invitation for the family to spend a fortnight at Ravenshollow Park, the Blackthorn country estate in Kent, where the formal arrangements would be settled. Margaret received this news with an expression of such profound dismay that one might have supposed she had been informed of an impending execution rather than an alliance with the most sought-after gentleman in England. She rose from the pianoforte, her face pale as parchment, and excused herself to her chambers, claiming a sudden indisposition. Catherine watched her sister's retreat with concern, noting the trembling of her hands and the unshed tears that brightened her eyes. The Earl, summoned from his study, received the news with considerably more enthusiasm than his elder daughter had displayed. The alliance would be magnificent, uniting two of England's oldest families, securing Margaret's future in a manner beyond their wildest aspirations and bringing considerable prestige to the Pembroke name. He declared they would accept the invitation immediately and began making arrangements for their departure to Kent. Catherine found herself in the peculiar position of being the only member of the household who seemed to perceive the approaching catastrophe. She knew what others did not, that Margaret's heart was already engaged, irrevocably and completely, by Mr. James Hartley, a gentleman of respectable though modest means who served as secretary to a prominent member of Parliament. Their attachment, conducted with utmost discretion through stolen moments at circulating libraries and carefully orchestrated encounters in Hyde Park, had escaped the notice of their parents, but not Catherine's observant eyes. The journey to Ravenshollow Park required the better part of a day, their carriage rolling through the verdant Kent countryside as spring displayed itself in full glory. Margaret sat rigid beside her mother, her complexion still unnaturally pale despite the rouge the Countess had insisted she apply. Catherine occupied the opposite seat, her sketchbook open on her lap, though her attention remained fixed on her sister's evident distress. Ravenshollow Park emerged from behind a grove of ancient oaks like something from a Gothic romance, all grey stone and mullioned windows, with towers that pierced the afternoon sky. The estate stretched as far as the eye could see, encompassing formal gardens, a deer park, and a lake that reflected the house's imposing facade. Even the Earl, not given to displays of emotion, whistled low at the magnificence before them. The Duchess of Blackthorn awaited them in the blue drawing-room, a chamber so named for its Prussian blue silk wall coverings and the priceless collection of Chinese porcelain displayed in gilt-edged cases. Her Grace was a woman of 60 years, her silver hair arranged in an elaborate coiffure that had been fashionable in her youth, her black bombazine gown a testament to her continued mourning for her late husband. Her eyes, the same piercing gray as her son's, assessed the Pembroke family with the calculating gaze of a general surveying troops. She pronounced herself delighted with Margaret's appearance, though she suggested certain improvements to her deportment that might better suit the future mistress of Ravenshollow Park. Margaret endured this examination with admirable composure, though Catherine noticed the white knuckles of her clenched hands hidden in the folds of her muslin gown. The Duke himself was absent, attending to matters of business in London, but was expected to arrive the following afternoon. This delay seemed to offer Margaret a temporary reprieve, though it also prolonged the agony of anticipation. The Duchess outlined the week's activities with military precision: morning rides, afternoon teas, evening entertainments, and a grand ball to conclude their visit, where the betrothal would be formally announced. That first evening passed in a blur of elaborate courses served on Sèvres porcelain, and conversation that ranged from the safe topics of weather and mutual acquaintances to the Duchess's pronounced opinions on everything from the proper management of servants to the ideal number of children a duchess should produce. Catherine, seated at the far end of the table as befitted her status as the younger unmarried daughter, observed the proceedings with growing unease. The following afternoon brought the sound of hooves on gravel, announcing the Duke's arrival. The family assembled in the green salon, Margaret positioned prominently near the window, where the afternoon light would show her beauty to best advantage. Catherine stood partially concealed behind a potted palm, her position offering an unobstructed view of the proceedings, whilst remaining largely unnoticed herself. Robert Blackthorn, 9th Duke of his line, entered the room with the confident stride of a man accustomed to having the world arrange itself according to his pleasure. He stood above 6 feet in height, his figure shown to advantage in a perfectly tailored coat of midnight blue superfine. His hair, black as a raven's wing, was cropped in the Brutus style, fashionable amongst gentlemen of sporting inclination. But it was his eyes that commanded attention, gray like his mother's, but where hers were cold and calculating, his held a subtle gleam of self-deprecating humor, suggesting a man well aware of the spectacle of his own arrival, carefully concealed beneath the practiced hauteur expected of his station. He bowed correctly to the Earl and Countess, exchanged pleasantries about their journey, and then turned his attention to Margaret. Catherine watched as her sister executed a perfect curtsy, her training overcoming her emotional turmoil. The Duke's expression as he regarded his intended bride was politely appreciative, but notably lacking in the passionate admiration Margaret's beauty typically inspired. The conversation that followed adhered strictly to the conventions of polite society. The Duke inquired about Margaret's accomplishments, her music, her languages, her needlework. Margaret responded with monosyllabic replies that bordered on the discourteous, though the Duchess seemed to attribute this to maidenly modesty rather than reluctance. Throughout this painful exchange, the Duke's gaze repeatedly drifted to the corner where Catherine stood, though whether he could actually perceive her through the palm fronds remained uncertain. It was then that disaster struck in the form of a carelessly placed music folio. Margaret, rising to demonstrate her skill at the pianoforte at the Duchess's insistence, caught her hem on the corner of the stand. The sudden movement sent sheets of music cascading across the floor. Without thinking, Catherine emerged from her semi-concealment to assist her sister, dropping to her knees to gather the scattered pages. She became aware of a presence beside her and looked up to find the Duke himself kneeling on the Aubusson carpet, helping to collect the wayward sheets. Their eyes met across a handful of Mozart sonatas, and Catherine felt something shift in her chest, as though her heart had suddenly forgotten its proper rhythm. Up close, she could see flecks of blue in those gray eyes, could smell the subtle blend of sandalwood and leather that clung to his person, could observe the slight scar that bisected his left eyebrow, an imperfection that somehow enhanced rather than marred his classical features. Time seemed to suspend itself as they knelt there, the scattered music between them like tea leaves waiting to be read. The Duke's expression underwent a series of subtle transformations. Surprise, curiosity, and something else Catherine could not quite identify, but which made her cheeks warm with unaccustomed heat. His hand, reaching for the same sheet she had targeted, briefly covered hers. Even through her glove, she felt the warmth of his touch, the strength in those long fingers. The moment shattered as the Duchess's voice cut through the silence, inquiring with barely concealed irritation what was causing the delay. The Duke rose smoothly, offering Catherine his hand to help her to her feet. She accepted, though the contact sent another tremor through her composure. He held her hand a moment longer than strictly necessary, his thumb brushing almost imperceptibly across her knuckles before releasing her. Margaret's performance at the pianoforte proceeded without further incident, though Catherine noticed the Duke's attention seemed oddly divided, his gaze frequently straying from the acknowledged beauty at the instrument to the younger sister who had resumed her place in the shadows. When Margaret concluded her piece, a technically proficient but emotionally vacant rendition of a popular arie, the Duke's applause was polite but perfunctory. The days that followed established a pattern that would have been comical had the stakes not been so desperately high. The Duchess orchestrated encounters between her son and Margaret with the precision of a chess master positioning pieces on a board. Morning rides through the estate, afternoon promenades in the gardens, evening gatherings in the various drawing rooms, all designed to throw the couple together and advance the alliance toward its inevitable conclusion. Yet for every carefully orchestrated encounter, there seemed to be an equal number of accidental meetings between the Duke and Catherine. She would be sketching in the rose garden when he happened to pass on his morning ride. He would discover her in the library, searching for a particular volume of poetry, just as he came to return a book on agricultural improvements. They would find themselves inexplicably paired for a game of whist when numbers at the card table required a fourth. During these encounters, conversation flowed between them with an ease that stood in marked contrast to the stilted exchanges between the Duke and Margaret. They discussed literature, discovering a mutual admiration for the romanticism of Byron despite the scandal attached to his name. They debated politics, Catherine surprising him with her informed opinions on Catholic emancipation and the Corn Laws. They shared observations on art, music, philosophy, and the thousand small topics that revealed compatible minds and complementary spirits. The Duke learned that Catherine's watercolors, far from being the typical feminine dabbling, showed real talent and keen observation. Catherine discovered that beneath his ducal reserve lay a man of deep feeling and unexpected humor, who could quote Shakespeare as readily as he could discuss crop rotation, who treated his servants with genuine consideration, and who possessed a self-deprecating wit that emerged when he felt comfortable. One particularly memorable encounter occurred during an afternoon thunderstorm that trapped them both in the conservatory. Catherine had sought shelter there while sketching exotic blooms, and the Duke had apparently had the same thought whilst returning from visiting a tenant farmer. The rain drummed against the glass roof as they stood amongst the orchids and orange trees, the air heavy with perfume and possibility. The Duke had been examining her sketchbook when he paused at a particular drawing, not of flowers, but of the view from the terrace with a solitary figure on horseback in the distance. Though the figure was too small to be clearly identified, something in the posture, the way the rider sat his mount, marked him unmistakably as the Duke himself. Catherine felt heat rise to her cheeks as he studied the drawing with intense concentration. When he finally looked up, his expression was unreadable, though his eyes held a warmth that made her breath catch. He spoke of the loneliness of his position, the weight of expectations that had governed his life since his father's death, the dutiful nature of every choice he had ever made. Catherine found herself sharing her own sense of displacement, always in Margaret's shadow, always the observer rather than the observed, finding solace in art and books rather than the glittering world of the ton. The storm passed, as storms do, but something had changed between them. An understanding, perhaps, or recognition, that sensation of finding in another person an echo of one's own hidden self. Meanwhile, Margaret's situation grew increasingly desperate. Her attempts to discourage the Duke's suit, whilst not openly defying her parents or insulting the Duchess, required a delicate balance she struggled to maintain. She developed mysterious headaches that prevented her from riding, sudden indispositions that limited her time at the pianoforte, and an unprecedented interest in theological discussions that bordered on the inappropriate for polite company. The Duchess, far from being discouraged, seemed to view these behaviors as challenges to be overcome. She prescribed remedies for the headaches, insisted on lighter musical selections that would not tax Margaret's delicate constitution, and steered all theological discussions toward the appropriate role of a duchess in supporting the local church. Her determination was matched only by Margaret's increasingly creative resistance. Catherine became the unwilling confidant of both parties. Margaret would creep into her room at night, tears streaming down her face, begging for help in escaping a fate she viewed as worse than death. She spoke of James Hartley with a passion that would have shocked their parents, of plans they had made for a simple life together, of the impossibility of living as another man's wife when her heart was so completely given. The Duke, in their stolen moments together, never spoke directly of his growing reluctance toward the match, but Catherine read it in every line of his body, every carefully neutral comment about the wedding arrangements, every glance he cast in her direction when he thought no one was observing. He was a man of honor, bound by his word and his mother's arrangements, but the prospect of marriage to Margaret brought him no joy. The situation reached a crisis during a picnic by the lake. The Duchess had arranged the outing with typical attention to detail. Persian rugs spread on the grass, footmen in attendance with silver dishes, a string quartet playing softly in the distance. Margaret, pressed to show her skill at archery, an accomplishment the Duchess deemed essential for a lady of sporting inclination, missed every target with such consistency that it could only have been deliberate. The Duke, observing Margaret's deliberate failures with growing interest, saw in them an opportunity he had been secretly hoping might present itself. With calculated determination masked as casual suggestion, he proposed that perhaps Lady Catherine might demonstrate the proper technique. It was a socially acceptable pretense, he knew, one that would allow him the proximity he had been craving since their first encounter amongst the scattered music sheets. Catherine, trapped by the rules of politeness and her mother's watchful eye, could not refuse without causing the very scene they all sought to avoid. As she notched the arrow, the Duke stepped behind her, ostensibly to correct her stance. His hand covered hers on the bow, his breath warm against her ear as he murmured instructions about aim and release. The arrow, when loosed, flew straight and true to the center of the target, though Catherine could never afterward remember actually releasing it, so overwhelmed was she by his proximity. The Countess observed this interaction with sharp eyes, and that evening, she took Catherine aside for a conversation that left no doubt about her position. Catherine was to cease monopolizing the Duke's attention. She was to remember her place as the younger sister. She was to support Margaret's match with appropriate enthusiasm. Any behavior that might jeopardize this alliance would result in consequences too severe to contemplate. In the tense days that preceded the ball, Catherine fulfilled her mother's command with painful perfection. She became a polite ghost within the household, her sketchbook remaining closed in her chamber, her opinions left unvoiced, an impenetrable wall of courtesy erected where once there had been easy conversation with the Duke. He noticed the change, of course, the confusion and hurt that flickered in his eyes when she excused herself from their accidental encounters only deepened her misery. Yet she persevered in this charade, understanding that her family's future depended upon her sister's match, even as each carefully maintained distance felt like another small death. The grand ball that would seal Margaret and the Duke's betrothal approached with the inevitability of fate. The household bustled with preparations. Gowns arrived from London modistes, jewels were removed from safes and polished to brilliance, and the ancient ballroom of Ravenshollow Park was decorated with thousands of hothouse flowers that filled the air with almost overwhelming sweetness. 2 nights before the ball, Catherine found herself unable to sleep. She wrapped herself in a shawl and ventured into the gardens, seeking solace in the cool night air and the distant sound of nightingales. The moon, nearly full, transformed the formal gardens into a silvered wonderland of shadow and light. She wandered without particular direction, her thoughts as tangled as the box hedge maze she skirted. She discovered she was not alone in seeking nocturnal peace. The Duke stood by the ornamental pond, his figure stark against the moonlit water. He turned at her approach, and neither felt the need to offer excuses or explanations for their presence. It seemed the most natural thing in the world that they should both be there, at that moment, as though drawn by invisible threads. They walked together through the gardens, their conversation flowing from the profound to the trivial, and back again. They paused to observe the moon, nearly full in its celestial glory, and found themselves debating whether such heavenly bodies truly influenced human fate, or whether mortals possessed the free will to chart their own courses. The Duke argued for destiny, speaking of forces beyond human control that drew people together despite all obstacles. Catherine countered with a defensive choice, though her voice faltered as she recognized how little choice either of them truly possessed in their current circumstances. The irony was not lost on either party. Here they stood, discussing free will whilst bound by chains of duty neither had forged. They paused beneath an ancient oak, its branches creating a natural bower that seemed to exist outside the normal flow of time. The Duke turned to face her fully, and Catherine saw in his expression something that made her heart race with terrifying hope. He spoke of duty and honor, of the chains that bound him to choices made by others, of the impossible position in which he found himself. He did not declare himself, could not, given the circumstances, but his meaning was clear in every carefully chosen word, every weighted pause, every look that said what lips could not. Catherine understood, with a clarity that was both blessing and curse, that he had come to care for her as she had for him. The knowledge brought not joy, but exquisite pain, for what could come of such feelings when he was bound to marry her sister? She told him, with quiet dignity that cost her everything to maintain, that she understood the constraints of their situation, that she honored him for his commitment to duty, even as it broke her heart, that she would find a way to be happy for Margaret, to support the match, to dance at their wedding with a smile that would fool everyone but him. The Duke reached out, his fingers barely brushing her cheek, a touch so light it might have been imagination. In that moment, with the moon as witness and the nightingales providing nature's own lament, they stood on the precipice of something that could never be. The weight of all the words unspoken, all the futures that would never unfold, pressed down upon them like a physical thing. A sound from the house, a door closing perhaps, or a window being shuttered, broke the spell. They stepped apart, the space between them suddenly vast as an ocean. Without another word, they turned back toward the house, walking separately through their shadows, stretched long by the moon, seemed reluctant to part. The next day brought a flurry of activity as guests began arriving for the ball. County families, London notables, anyone of consequence within 50 miles had been invited to witness the triumph of the Duchess's matchmaking. Catherine threw herself into helping with the preparations, anything to avoid thinking about the previous night, about the feel of his fingers against her skin, about the future stretching ahead like a prison sentence. Margaret, meanwhile, had reached a state of desperation that manifested in an almost otherworldly calm. She moved through the preparations like an automaton, allowing herself to be dressed and coiffed and bejeweled without protest or enthusiasm. Only Catherine noticed the letter her sister posted that morning, addressed in a hand that trembled despite Margaret's apparent composure. The afternoon of the ball, as Catherine helped Margaret into her gown, a confection of silver tissue over white satin that made her look like moonlight itself, her sister gripped her hands with sudden fierce intensity. She spoke in rapid, hushed tones of the impossible choice before her, of honor versus heart, of the catastrophe that would befall their family if she refused the Duke now, with all of society gathered to witness their betrothal. Catherine soothed her as best she could, though her own heart was breaking. She spoke of duty, of the comfort Margaret would find in wealth and position, of the children she would have, the good she could do as a duchess. Every word was ash in her mouth, but she spoke them nonetheless, because what else could she do? The ball began, as these affairs always did, with the arrival of guests in their finest attire, the presentation of young ladies in pristine white gowns, the careful choreography of social interaction that governed such events. The ballroom blazed with the light of 1,000 candles, their glow reflected in gilt mirrors and crystal chandeliers, until the very air seemed to shimmer with golden light. Margaret stood beside the Duke in the receiving line, a vision of beauty that drew gasps of admiration from every guest who passed. The Duke, resplendent in black evening dress with the blue ribbon of the Order of the Garter across his chest, played his part with ducal perfection. Only Catherine, watching from her position with the other unmarried young ladies, noticed the tension in his jaw, the way his gaze swept the room as though seeking escape. The dancing began with a minuet, the Duke leading Margaret through the stately figures with practiced ease. They were perfection itself, the golden goddess and the dark prince of every fairy tale ever told. The gathered company watched with the satisfaction of those witnessing a foregone conclusion, already composing the letters they would write tomorrow describing the magnificent couple. Catherine danced when asked, smiled when addressed, and felt each moment pass like a drop of poison slowly filling a cup. She caught glimpses of the Duke throughout the evening, always at a distance, always surrounded by well-wishers and sycophants eager to curry favor with the future Duchess of Blackthorn's family. It was just before the supper dance, the dance after which the betrothal would be announced, that everything changed. A commotion at the entrance drew attention as a travel-stained young man pushed past the footmen, his eyes wild as they searched the crowd. Catherine recognized James Hartley with a shock of prescient dread, understanding in an instant what his presence meant. Margaret saw him too. The color drained from her face so completely that the Countess moved toward her in alarm. But Margaret was already in motion, running, across the ballroom floor, her silver gown streaming behind her like water. The crowd parted in shocked silence as she threw herself into Hartley's arms, propriety and position forgotten in the face of desperate love. The scene that followed would be discussed in drawing rooms across England for years to come. Hartley's impassioned declaration that he could not let Margaret sacrifice herself for duty. Margaret's tearful admission that she loved him beyond reason or respectability. The Countess's swoon. The Earl's apoplectic rage. The Duchess's expression of Arctic fury that could have frozen hell itself. And through it all, the Duke stood perfectly still, his face arranged in the mask of ducal control that society expected of a man of his station. To the assembled company, he appeared unmoved, perhaps even coldly indifferent to the chaos unfolding before him. But for one brief, unguarded moment, his gaze found Catherine across the tumultuous ballroom. In that fraction of a second, he allowed her, and only her, to witness the truth beneath his practiced composure. She saw not just relief at his unexpected freedom, but a maelstrom of emotions. Fury at his mother's machinations, deep concern for Catherine's position in this scandal, and something else, a wild, desperate hope for possibilities that had seemed forever closed to them, now suddenly, impossibly, beginning to crack open like the first light of dawn. Margaret and Hartley fled the ballroom hand in hand, leaving devastation in their wake. The guests buzzed like disturbed wasps, scandal and speculation flowing as freely as the champagne. The Duchess pronounced that no member of the Pembroke family would ever again be received at Ravenshollow Park. The Earl declared Margaret dead to him. The Countess required the continuous application of smelling salts. It was then that the Duchess played her final card. She turned to Catherine with the calculating gaze of a chess player who sees checkmate 3 moves ahead. If one Pembroke daughter had proved unsuitable, perhaps the other would serve. The contracts were already drawn, the settlements agreed upon. Only the name need be changed. The Duke's voice cut through his mother's pronouncement like a blade through silk. He would not, he stated with quiet finality, transfer his supposed affections from one sister to another like a man purchasing horses at Tattersall's. The insult to both Lady Catherine and himself was not to be borne. But the Duchess was not finished. She spoke of scandal, of the humiliation the Duke would face, of the damage to the Blackthorn name. She spoke of the financial arrangements already in place, of the expectations of their guests, of the necessity of saving face. And then, with the cunning that had made her feared throughout the ton, she spoke of the ruin that would fall upon Catherine if the Duke did not marry her. After all, everyone had seen them together, in the conservatory, in the garden, at the archery grounds. Without the protection of marriage to the Duke, Catherine would be tainted by her sister's scandal, assumed to have been part of the deception, condemned to spinsterhood or worse. The Duke could survive the gossip, but could he condemn an innocent young woman to social destruction? Catherine watched the trap close around them both with horrible clarity. She saw the moment the Duke understood his mother's gambit, saw him weigh honor against inclination, duty against desire. When he turned to her, she already knew what he would say. He proposed with formal correctness, down on one knee in front of 200 witnesses, offering his hand and title to save her from ruin. As he knelt, his face maintained the mask of formal propriety required for their audience. But his eyes, when they met Catherine's, contained a silent, desperate plea. It was not merely a question about marriage, but an appeal for understanding, a supplication that she might see past the Duke to the man beneath, acting in the only way honor allowed to shield her from society's cruelty. Catherine accepted with equal formality, her voice steady despite the tears that threatened, understanding in that moment that this proposal, witnessed by all, was both salvation and sentence. The crowd, hungry for drama, erupted in applause that sounded like mockery to her ears. The wedding took place 3 weeks later in the chapel at Ravenshollow Park. It was a modest affair by ducal standards, necessity and propriety dictating a swift, quiet ceremony rather than the grand cathedral wedding originally planned for Margaret. Catherine stood at the altar in her mother's wedding gown, hastily altered, her face hidden beneath an ancient veil of Mechlin lace that had belonged to some long-dead Blackthorn bride. The Duke waited at the altar with an expression of grave courtesy that revealed nothing. They spoke their vows in voices that barely carried to the small gathering of witnesses. When the vicar pronounced them man and wife, the Duke lifted her veil with steady hands and pressed the briefest of kisses to her lips, a touch so light and impersonal it might have been the brush of a falling leaf. The wedding breakfast was an exercise in endurance. The Duchess presided with grim satisfaction, having salvaged something from the wreckage of her plans. The Earl and Countess maintained rigid propriety, though neither could bring themselves to offer genuine congratulations. The few guests present seemed more interested in gathering gossip than celebrating the union. That evening, as Catherine sat in the Duchess's chambers that were now hers, she listened to the sounds of the house settling into sleep. Her new husband had excused himself after dinner, citing estate business that required immediate attention. She understood the message in his absence. This marriage might be legal, but it would not be real. They established a pattern in the weeks that followed. The Duke was unfailingly polite, treating her with the same courteous distance he might show a respected acquaintance. They breakfasted together when he was in residence, discussed household matters, appeared together at necessary social functions. To the outside world, they presented a united front. In private, they were strangers sharing a house. Catherine threw herself into her new role with determination born of desperation. She learned the management of the vast household, won over the servants with her genuine interest in their welfare, and began the delicate work of establishing herself in local society. If she could not have her husband's love, she would at least prove herself worthy of his name. The Duke, for his part, seemed to spend increasing amounts of time away from Ravenshollow Park. Business in London, he said. Visits to the other estates. Parliamentary duties. Catherine never questioned these absences, understanding them as part of their unspoken agreement to maintain careful distance. It was Mrs. Pemberton, the housekeeper who had served the Blackthorne family for 3 decades, who inadvertently revealed the truth. She had observed the new Duchess with the keen eye of a longtime servant who understood far more than her betters credited. In the months since the wedding, she had witnessed Her Grace transform Ravenshollow Park with quiet efficiency, had seen her kindness to the staff, her genuine interest in their welfare, and most tellingly, the melancholy that shadowed her eyes whenever the Duke departed for his frequent absences. The old servant had also observed His Grace's careful distance from his young wife, a distance that seemed to pain him as much as it did her. So when she mentioned, with perhaps not entirely innocent casualness during a review of household accounts, her pleasure that His Grace had finally removed those troublesome letters from his study, such a dark cloud they had cast over the house, she knew precisely what seed she was planting. Sometimes, she reasoned, even the nobility needed a gentle push toward the happiness that pride prevented them from claiming. Curiosity overcame propriety. That night, Catherine entered her husband's study, a room she normally avoided. The letters were gone from his desk, but a search revealed them in the fireplace, waiting to be burned. She pulled them out, her hands shaking as she recognized Margaret's handwriting. The letters told a story that changed everything Catherine thought she knew. They were love letters between Margaret and James Hartley, written over the course of a year, somehow intercepted by the Duchess and kept as evidence of Margaret's unsuitability. But it was the last letter, dated the morning of the ball, that stopped Catherine's heart. In it, Margaret poured out her anguish to Hartley about the impossible situation she found herself in. She wrote of her love for him, a love so profound that the thought of belonging to another was unbearable. She begged his forgiveness for the deception she had maintained with her family, for allowing them to believe she would marry the Duke when her heart had long been irrevocably given to another. She wrote of the guilt that consumed her, knowing that her inability to refuse the Duke directly, bound as she was by her parents' authority and the weight of family honor, had led them all to this moment of crisis. Her words painted a picture of a woman torn between duty to her family and truth to her heart, ultimately choosing love, even knowing the catastrophe it would bring. But there was more. A note in the Duke's hand, apparently never sent, addressed to Catherine herself. In it, he confessed his feelings, his struggle between duty and desire, his decision to honor the agreement with Margaret despite his growing attachment to her sister. He wrote of that night in the garden, of words unspoken, of the torture of wanting what honor forbade him to pursue. Catherine sank into her husband's chair, the letters clutched to her chest, as understanding dawned. They had all been victims of a complex web of sacrifice and misunderstanding. Margaret had fled not from selfishness, but from the impossibility of maintaining her deception. The Duke had accepted Catherine not from duty alone, but from feelings he believed she could never return. And she had accepted him thinking herself a burden he was honor-bound to bear. The sound of footsteps in the hall startled her. The Duke stood in the doorway, his expression shifting from surprise to understanding as he saw the letters in her hands. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, the weight of all their misconceptions hanging between them like a veil waiting to be lifted. The Duke entered the study slowly, closing the door behind him with deliberate care. The light from the dying fire cast shadows across his face, making his expression difficult to read. Catherine rose from his chair, the letters still clutched in her hands, her heart beating so rapidly she thought it might escape her chest entirely. Neither spoke for what seemed an eternity. Then, with careful precision, the Duke crossed the room until he stood before her. close enough that she could see the pulse beating at his throat, could smell the familiar scent of sandalwood that always accompanied him. His voice, when he finally spoke, was rough with suppressed emotion. He told her of the torment of the past months, of loving where he believed himself despised, of maintaining distance when every instinct demanded he close it. He spoke of watching her transform Ravenshollow Park into a true home, of the pride he felt in her accomplishments, of the agony of sleeping rooms apart from a wife he dared not touch. Catherine found her own voice then, speaking the truths she had kept locked away like dangerous treasures. She told him of that night in the garden, of the moment by the lake, of loving him even as she believed herself the chain that bound him. She spoke of the letters, of Margaret's sacrifice, of the tragic comedy of errors that had brought them to this moment. The Duke reached out, his fingers trembling slightly as they traced the path of tears she had not realized were falling. This time, there was no hesitation in his touch, no duty or propriety holding him back. When he kissed her, it was with all the passion and tenderness that had been denied them. A kiss that spoke of endings and beginnings, of love deferred but not destroyed. The fire had burned to embers by the time they finally drew apart, though neither felt the chill. They talked through the night, sharing truths and dreams, laughing at their mutual blindness, marveling at the strange paths by which fate had brought them together. The Duke confessed he had been meeting with solicitors in London, trying to find a way to provide for her separately should she wish for an annulment. Catherine admitted she had been preparing to retreat to the dower house, believing her presence a daily reminder of his forced sacrifice. As dawn painted the sky rose and gold, they stood at the window of the study, Catherine safe in the circle of her husband's arms, watching the estate wake to a new day. The Duke pointed out the various improvements he had planned but never implemented, waiting to consult the wife he had been too careful to approach. Catherine shared her own visions for the estate, ideas she had recorded in journals but never dared voice. The household, when it woke, found their master and mistress breakfasting together in the small dining room rather than the formal hall. Their heads bent close in conversation, their hands linked on the table between them. Mrs. Pemberton would later tell the others that she had never seen His Grace smile so freely, nor her Grace blush so becomingly. Word came, eventually, of Margaret and James Hartley. They had married by special license and sailed for India, where Hartley had secured a position with the East India Company. The letter Margaret sent Catherine was full of joy and gratitude, blessing the sister who had unknowingly made her happiness possible. The Earl and Countess, faced with the fait accompli of both daughters married, gradually accepted the situation, particularly as the Duke's obvious devotion to Catherine became the talk of the ton. The Duchess, that formidable matriarch, maintained her dignity through sheer force of will. Though she never quite admitted her machinations had been wrong, she did allow, in a private moment with Catherine, that perhaps Providence had known better than she which sister would make the better Duchess. It was as close to approval as Catherine would ever receive, and she accepted it as such. Ravenshollow Park flourished under the united guidance of the Duke and Duchess of Blackthorn. Children came in due course, 3 boys and 2 girls who grew up in a household where love was expressed freely and laughter echoed through the ancient halls. The Ton, always ready to embrace a romantic tale with a happy ending, transformed the scandal of the switched sisters into a legend of true love conquering all obstacles. Years later, when their eldest daughter came of age, Catherine found her in the garden one evening, reading beneath the same oak tree where her parents had once stood in moonlight, bound by duty and separated by misunderstanding. The girl looked up from her book, a romantic novel, Catherine noted with amusement, and asked if her parents' story was truly as romantic as everyone claimed. Catherine considered her daughter's question, thinking of all the pain and confusion that had preceded their happiness, of the sacrifices made and misunderstandings endured. Then she looked toward the house, where her husband stood on the terrace, watching them with that particular smile he reserved for his family. And she knew her answer. Love, she told her daughter, was not always as simple as novels would have one believe. Sometimes it came disguised as duty, sometimes it required sacrifice, and sometimes it demanded the courage to see past what seemed to be to what truly was. But when it was real, when it was true, It was worth every obstacle, every misunderstanding, every moment of pain that preceded its triumph. The Duke joined them then, slipping his arm around his wife's waist with the easy affection of long married love. Their daughter, with the wisdom of youth, declared their story better than any novel, for it had the virtue of being true. As the family walked back toward the house, the setting sun painting Ravenshollow Park in shades of gold, Catherine reflected that her daughter was right, though perhaps not in the way she meant. Their story was better than a novel because it was built upon foundations that novels rarely explored. The profound intimacy that developed when two people chose, each morning, to honor the vows they had once spoken in confusion and pain. It flourished in the accumulation of 10,000 small moments that no chronicler would think to record. The way the Duke learned exactly how Catherine preferred her tea, adjusting it without asking as the seasons changed her taste. The manner in which Catherine would smooth the worry lines from his forehead when parliamentary debates had gone poorly. The silent communication that developed between them, where a single glance could convey entire conversations across a crowded ballroom. Their love story was written in the margins of everyday life, in the way the Duke would leave poetry on her pillow when he knew she had endured a difficult day with his mother, in how Catherine would ensure his favorite brandy was waiting in the library after long rides through the estate visiting tenants. It lived in their shared laughter over private jokes no one else would understand, in the comfort they found in simply occupying the same room, each engaged in their own pursuits, yet profoundly aware of the other's presence. It thrived in the way Catherine knew to send for his favorite blend of tobacco from London when she noticed his supply running low, and how the Duke would surprise her with rare pigments for her watercolors, purchased from Italian merchants at considerable expense, but presented without fanfare, simply appearing in her painting box as if by magic. The seasons of their life together had each brought new depths to their affection. Spring saw them teaching their children to ride, the Duke's patience with their youngest daughter's fear of horses matched only by Catherine's gentle encouragement. Summer found them hosting grand house parties where they moved through their guests like dancers who knew every step by heart, each always aware of where the other stood in any room. Autumn brought quiet evenings by the fire, reading to each other from beloved books, sometimes the same volumes they had discussed in those early, uncertain days when love was something they dared not name. Winter meant Christmas festivities that filled Ravenshollow Park with light and laughter, their children's excitement a reflection of the joy their parents had built within those ancient walls. The dramatic revelations and grand gestures of their early days had been necessary, perhaps, to break through the walls of misunderstanding that had separated them. But their true romance lay in the 1,000 ways they chose each other daily, through seasons of joy and sorrow, through the challenges of raising children and managing estates, through the inevitable changes that time wrought upon them both. When their eldest son broke his arm falling from a tree, they had kept vigil together through the fevered nights, taking turns bathing his forehead with cool cloths. When Catherine lost the baby that would have been their 6th child, the Duke had held her through her grief, his own tears mingling with hers, never once suggesting she had failed him by not providing another heir. When the Duke's mother finally passed, Catherine had managed all the funeral arrangements with grace, despite years of difficult relations, because she knew it was what her husband needed. The Duke's hair silvered at the temples, and Catherine found it only made him more distinguished. Catherine's figure softened after bearing their children, and the Duke declared her more beautiful than the day they married, and meant it with his whole heart. He would still catch his breath sometimes when she entered a room, struck anew by the miracle that she was his. She would still feel her pulse quicken when his fingers brushed hers in passing, a reminder of that first touch over scattered sheet music so many years ago. They had learned to read each other's silences as easily as words, to offer comfort without being asked, to celebrate triumphs both large and small with equal enthusiasm. When the Duke successfully championed a bill for tenant farmers' rights in Parliament, Catherine organized a celebration that included every family on their estates. When Catherine's watercolor was selected for exhibition at Somerset House, submitted secretly by the Duke, he stood beside her at the gallery, his pride evident to all who observed them. Their love had evolved from the desperate passion of youth into something deeper, richer, more nuanced, a tapestry woven from countless threads of shared experience, mutual respect, and abiding affection. Where once they had loved with the fierce uncertainty of those who feared love might be snatched away, now they loved with the quiet confidence of those who had weathered storms together and knew their bond could withstand whatever challenges lay ahead. And so another tale of hearts united reaches its blessed conclusion. Love, it seems, finds a way even through the strictest conventions of proper society, though it may take rather more circuitous a route than one might prefer, requiring switched sisters, sacrificial choices, and no small amount of providence to reach its destined end.